Who's in the room?
Yes, sir.
Who's in the room?
Yes, sir.
Are you ready to get smart?
Yeah.
Are you ready to get smart? Alright. Here we go. Pick it up now. Pick it up now. Pick it up now. Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, good morning. Hope you're all in fine health. Okay, so just wanted to go over the objectives which you need to create for the NEA. So firstly, need to see what AQA say. So they're the boss, that's the spec which everything is going to be judged against, so that's a good idea to know exactly what they want. So if we just have a quick look at what they're after. Okay, so this document is quite useful and it goes over what the project's all about, the different types of problems you can do, so a few ideas, so a computer game, artificial intelligence, something with an Arduino board, you name it, all sorts of cool things. And then it goes on to the document structure. So this is where you're getting the marks, different sections, and you can see you got 9 marks for the analysis. However, don't think that you can just put no analysis, you lose those 9 marks, but you still got access to all the rest. Because those 9 marks, that analysis section sets up the rest of the project. So you do need a decent analysis, and then you can kick forward and reference that for the rest of the project. Okay, so when we're trying to mark it, we essentially have to determine which range we're on, and then sort of, okay, are we at the top or the bottom of it? Hopefully we're all aiming here. Even if you don't think you can program to A-star standard, we can still aim for the top-notch analysis. So this is just going through, making sure we do everything right, making sure we have all the details, and a good analysis will then enable you to get the marks elsewhere. So what it says, it needs a fully or nearly fully scoped analysis of a real problem. This is where I've been trying to get you to see if you can do something real as opposed to just, well, I'm going to make this. And it needs to be presented in a way a third party can understand, so if your parents can understand your analysis, you're onto a winner. So requirements, we will get to that in more detail this lesson, so it needs to be measurable, appropriate, and covering everything. So you can't just say, well, I'm going to create a Mario game, it needs to contain a princess, full stop. I'm sure there's lots more to a Mario game than just a princess. Requirements arrived at by considering through dialogue the needs of the intended users of the system. This is where I've been hammering you to actually talk to people. If you don't talk to people, then you can't get into the top range of marks. And I've had several projects where they've done an awesome analysis and they just haven't spoken to anyone, so that plummets them down. Even in the middle section it says through dialogue, the bottom section says through dialogue, so you really need that in order to access any sort of reasonable mark. And then problems sufficiently well modeled to be of use in subsequent stages. So it needs to actually be something which is useful. Okay, so why do we need decent analysis and objectives? Many of the objectives which we're looking at the moment essentially is going to be your guide for the project. If you create one set of objectives and you give it to 100 different coders, they should all be able to make a solution which your client would be happy with. No doubt they'd all be vastly different, they'd all have different aspects. However, your client should be happy with anything which meets those objectives. when you're doing this for a job, if you actually have a client who you're trying to get money from, then some of them will try to be a bit awkward and sort of, well, no, we're not paying you yet because it doesn't do what you said it would do. And if you can then go through the objectives with them one by one and say, well, it does this, yes, does this, yes, does this, yes, does all the objectives, therefore it does do what you asked, therefore I've done what you've contracted me for, therefore you will pay me. That is essentially the way that some businesses work, and previously I've had a lot of people trying to withhold paychecks because it's not quite working how they wanted it as opposed to what they asked for. So you need to make sure that your objectives are clear, and usually if you're doing it in business, you'll go back to the client before you even start the project and say, okay, these are the objectives which I think you want, can you confirm that you're happy with them? And then once they've confirmed on those, as long as you meet those objectives, you're getting paid. I've also had some clients where somebody set objectives which are so wishy-washy that they just say, well, it doesn't do this. So, well, yes, it does. And they'll just argue the toss. They'll just say, actually, I don't think it does. So until it does, stream something with no lag or whatever. So, well, you can't have no lag. You've got to have some lag. Yeah, but there's too much lag. Well, who's deciding that? If the client's deciding that before they pay you, then they're not going to be too generous with their assessment. Also, your objectives will help with your write-up going forward. So the next sections, you can say, okay, I'm designing this bit because of this objective, or I'm writing this bit because of this, or I'm testing this because of this objective. So it's an awesome way to link everything through your report and make a very well written, cohesive report. Even if you're not generally good at sort of writing reports, having some good objectives allows you to lean on them and sort of use them as a crutch throughout your report quite effectively. Okay, so to make a good objective, kind of needs to be smart. And I briefly touched on this before. And so, okay, what actually is smart? Well, if we shamelessly steal a presentation from the internet, go back to the beginning, SMART objectives. So yeah, it's an acronym and it goes through these ones. So specific. So generally it needs to answer a W question. Okay, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you trying to accomplish it? Who's involved? Okay, the where doesn't really make so much of an issue on ours, but it's really getting some of the specific questions so you're not just having some wishy-washy objectives of sort of, oh yeah, it needs to be better. It needs to be measurable. Okay, how much lag is acceptable? How many enemies do you need? How many levels do you need? Otherwise, people will argue that it's not made and try and withhold your money, or in this case, withhold your marks. Achievable and ambitious. Quite how one letter counts for two words, I'm not sure. But it needs to be something which you can actually do. And it needs to be something which is slightly challenging. You are after an A level for this piece of work after all. So something which is within realms of possibility and which you can actually do. Okay, realistic and relevant. Okay, I'd go for relevant. So does it actually link to the project at all? If you're writing a Mario type game, is it really relevant that it adds two numbers together? I'm sure you can do that, but that's not really relevant to the project. Does it match your end goal? So this is where on your objectives, you can say, okay, I'm creating this objective because in my user interview it said this. I'm creating this objective because my research has shown this. And linking them up even further back is an awesome way to write your objectives, either as part of the objectives or slightly later. So I've seen some write-ups with an analysis section and then a justification of the analysis, and that goes down really well and it makes it really nice and clear, and that's what you're after. And then time bound. You've got a time limit, ideally September. If you're trying to do something which is at some point in the future, then it's not ideal. When you're in business, if you're trying to do something sort of it will never break, well, when's never? Will they just withhold your money and say, well, it might break tomorrow? And that wouldn't be never. So proven reliability over a week or something like that is something which you can add into it to make it time bound. Yeah, you can start off with the headline saying it needs to be robust. However, you need to actually make it so it is time bound, so you're not going to end up that they're just going to try and drag off the paycheck forever. Or whether that means that you can't actually meet the objectives because, yeah, you need to actually hand it in. Think also about when we're trying to get it, what resources you'll have in that time. So if you're trying to test something over an entire academic year, probably won't be able to do that. If you're trying to get something where you want to test it with a couple of students, that's probably possible and we could probably do those tests. So have a think about what limits there are on what you're trying to say. Be smart. Okay, now back from shameless stealing of presentations. Okay, so my main thing from there is sort of, can people argue the toss? If you say it must be challenging for your game, so okay, but what is challenging? For some people, certain things are challenging, others not so much. So is somebody going to play it and then say, well, that's not challenging, and therefore you haven't met your objective? And then is somebody else going to play it and say, well, that's too hard, it's not challenging, it's impossible, therefore you haven't met your objective? So something like it must have increasing difficulty is something which you can prove a lot more. So if you try to hand in your project and I say, well, I don't think you've met this objective, will you be able to argue that you have? If you can't argue that against me, then I'd say that your objective isn't accurate enough, if you can't even argue on a hypothetical project. So let's say you've made the program which you wanted, you reckon it meets the objective, you show it to me, and then I say, actually, I'm not convinced, can you argue that sufficiently? Is it a case of, well, it says there needs to be 3 different enemies, there you go, 1, 2, 3 different enemies. I can't really argue with that. I'd say that the objectives needs to be in the client's language. It needs to be in a language where your user will be able to read it and say, yep, that all makes sense to me and I'm happy with that. If you're trying to make a computer game, does the user care if it's in Python? Would that impact the project? Are you just tying your hands up for no real reason? Because you could then decide halfway through, actually I don't want to do it in Python, I want to do it in something else. Does that mean that it doesn't meet your objectives? Because generally if you've met all your other objectives, then I wouldn't say the language makes a difference. Some people say it needs to store this data with SQL. Why SQL? Does that make a difference to the user? Does that make the difference to the end product, to the experience? I'd argue not. So something which the user is happy with is ideal. So let's see some examples. So for Mario, you may sort of say, okay, you need to be able to control the main character, it needs to be a side-scrolling camera, the gameplay needs to be split into multiple levels. If you've created 2 levels of Mario, those shouldn't be in doubt. One of the projects which I made a while ago is a shower radio, so I didn't want to just listen to FM radio, however I just had an FM shower radio. So I created a system which would actually broadcast from a Raspberry Pi the music from my music library into the shower, because hey, I'm a geek. So for my objectives for that, I would have sort of, okay, it must be able to create a playlist. It's kind of useless if you can't control the music. Even if you've got a fairly limited library, I'm sure there's some things which you want to listen to more some days than others. After the playlist ends, must continue playing. Okay, so if I set a playlist of 5 songs and it happens to finish those 5 songs, I still want it playing something. And it must be able to deliver audio to the shower, because otherwise the whole project is kind of pointless if it doesn't fulfill the end goal. So make sure you are getting your end goal in there as well. Okay, so we do have some real examples. So Project Icarus has 8 out of 9 marks on the analysis. I'll send you over a link for that. And A Star has 9 out of 9 for the analysis. Both of those, well, the Project Icarus didn't lose marks on the objectives, so they're both good ideas to look at. When you have a look at them, notice how the objectives aren't just a list like that, 1, 2, 3. They are split down. So you must be able to control the character. There must be an option for the character to jump. Must be able to go forward and back. Must be able to duck. That sort of thing. Then you can say in your design, okay, I'm doing this because of objective 1A. Make sure you're numbering them or referencing them somehow, then you can refer back to them a lot easier. Okay, so I'll send over links to those ones. They're all on the VLE, but hopefully that gives you some idea of what you need to be doing on the objectives, and I would recommend focusing on them and trying to get some good objectives. Put them on OneNote when you're sorted, and then you got a record, and then you can work towards those for the rest of your project. You can keep referencing towards those. Okay, thank you very much.